Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our latest webinar today, Producing Meaningful Improvements in Problem Behavior of Persons with Autism, featuring Dr. Greg Hanley. My name is Jill Escher. I am the president of Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, one of your co-hosts today. And I'd like to introduce Eric Eberman from Autism New Jersey, who is your other co-host. Eric, say hello.
Hello, everyone.
And just to let you know that this is the third in our series called the Virtual Symposium on Severe Behaviors. This series arose out of a conference last year held by Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, where the subject of severe behaviors was of tremendous interest to our attendees, but we just couldn't fit in that much information in a one-day conference. So we decided to sort of offload some of that material into a webinar series instead. So that is the origin of this. And you can see the first two are archived. Everything's free. One is with Kim Sanders from Eucaro Systems, Eliminating Restrictive Practices. The other one is with Dr. Matt Siegel, who is renowned in his field. He works with many people with challenging behaviors up in Maine. His was called Multidisciplinary Approaches to Serious Challenging Behaviors in Autism. And we have one more coming up in December about crisis approaches with two leaders of the community school in Georgia. And before that, we had a number of other webinars. Those are also archived online for free at sfautismsociety.org/webinars. And you can see these here. They range from employment to criminal justice to social opportunities to research and to housing as well. One of these is this webinar with Amy Letts. It also addressed severe behaviors, and she's talked most specifically about ECT, which is a very particular intervention used in intractable cases of severe behaviors. On to some logistics. If you have questions for Dr. Hanley, you can look in your control panel. There's a question bar, and all you do is click on that, and you can type your questions in. Everybody is on mute, so you will not be asking questions live. That would be too complex for us to handle. And Eric and I will moderate those questions toward the end of this webinar, okay? But you can type the questions in at any time, all right? If you are calling in and you can't type in questions, but you have one to ask, feel free to email Eric at eberman, E-E-B-E-R-M-A-N, at autismnj.org. Now, if you hear my voice but you can't see the presentation screen, please look under your browser. Sometimes the screens are hiding underneath the other stuff on your laptop or your computer. Again, all of you are on mute, so don't worry about making any noise. The webinar is being recorded. It will run for about 2 hours, again with Q&A as time allows. And when it's recorded, it will be available at the same link that you registered. All right? Oops. Hold on. Sorry about that. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jill. I also just wanted to quickly mention that we have a lot of attendees today, so we're going to do our best to get through as many questions as possible, and I will go back and forth with my email and to the webinar platform too to make sure I try to get most of them down. So thanks. We're thrilled to have Dr. Hanley with us today to speak to you all about the innovative work and research that he and his team have done in the areas of practical functional assessment and skill-based treatment for problem behavior. Dr. Hanley has been applying the principles of learning to improve socially important behaviors of children and adults with and without disabilities for over 25 years. He's worked and trained at a number of places during his years, including the Kennedy Krieger Institute. He was degreed at University of Florida, was tenured at the University of Kansas, and is currently a professor of psychology and director of the Behavior Analysis Doctoral Program at Western New England University, and also an adjunct professor of psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Dr. Hanley has published over 100 chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals in areas such as assessment, treatment, and prevention of problem behavior, and evidence-based values. Dr. Hanley is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Division 25, a past associate editor of the Behavior Analyst, past editor of Behavior Analysis and Practice, and current editor of Java. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Greg Hanley.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, Jill, for the chance to link up with people via a webinar today. I'm going to describe today a practical functional assessment process, and I'll also have the chance to describe the related treatment process.
One second, I'm having a little logistical snafu, Dr. Hanley.
Okay.
To get to show your screen, I'm not exactly sure what happened, so bear with me, okay?
Okay.
Boy, this has never happened before. Show screen. Sorry, everybody. I'm very sorry. We will get this figured out, I assure you.
Jill, just this is Eric. I can see his screen right now.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, Greg, can you just go over like just
okay, maybe it's showing. Okay, guess what? It is showing.
Yep.
Yeah, it is showing. That was my bad. I am sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Hanley. I'm sorry, everyone.
No worries. That woke us all up. Okay, we're back. All right. Again, I'm going to go over functional assessment, but I am going to spend a fair amount of time on treatment today as well. Please understand that the treatment process I'm going to review is going to take into account context and the reasons why problem behavior is regularly occurring. There's going to be a focus on progressively building skills that serve the same purpose as the problem behavior, but skills also that will prepare the child or adult with autism for life's inevitable ambiguities and disappointments and opportunities. Please know, if you don't know me, that I am both a practitioner and a researcher, and therefore the assessment and treatment process I will convey today has been vetted in both real-world conditions while also being subjected to scrutiny of peer review. My research and practice group and my colleagues, we still have a lot of work to do to refine these procedures, to figure out how to transport them better to the people and context to which they are relevant. But I want to make it clear that the content that follows is neither conjecture nor is it aptly characterized as experimental. These processes I'll share with you today are actionable, and they're capable of improving outcomes for persons with autism today. I also want us to recognize the obvious impediment that we have but 90 minutes to understand a very complex behavioral phenomena and therapeutic process. Please know that more can be learned following this webinar at the website noted on the slide here. Now, depending on whether you're listening, yes, Eric.
Greg, this is Eric. Can I just interject real quick?
Of course.
I think the panel on your screen is still showing. If you hit that orange arrow there.
Okay, let me get rid of that.
Sorry about that. There you go.
No, thank you very much.
Sure.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better. Yep.
Perfect.
Okay, super. I'm going to go over the process in detail, and at times it may be technical. I'm going over those details because I imagine there's some BCBAs listening, and I want to make sure they understand those details. At the same time, I'm going to describe the process in terms of case studies, and I'm going to take some time to go through the values behind the process, and I think that'll help anyone else come along for the ride here. I'm going to talk for about an hour and 20. And then we'll have questions that'll be facilitated by Eric. Okay. So the aim of the treatment I'm going to talk about today is not just to minimize problem behavior. I want to make that clear up front. The aim of the treatment today is to restore balance in the relationships between persons with autism and their family members and their teachers, and without regrettable actions by either. Okay, the treatment is informed both by the unique attributes of the person with autism, as well as by the inevitable needs and expectations of others sharing homes, schools, and communities with the persons with autism. So what I'm trying to convey is that there's a mutual respect for persons with and without autism assumed within this treatment process. The treatment is informed by the person with autism's unique history. It's informed by their preferences and their current skill sets. while it's also being designed to create new and important experiences for that person. It involves teaching others to recognize and accommodate their preferences, while also teaching the person with autism to at first simply tolerate, but ultimately accommodate the reasonable preferences of others. At the end of a successful treatment process, balance can indeed be restored to families and classrooms. On one end is obvious and ample time for the persons with autism to satisfy their unique needs, to be the boss of their own experience, and to live and lead according to their desires. And on the other hand, we're going to have ample time to learn and to earn, to be challenged, to be held to high expectations, and to sacrifice the certain and immediate reward for the uncertain and delayed outcome. And by so doing, we hope to develop repertoires of behavior that are appreciated by others and ultimately appreciated by the person with autism themselves. Before I get going, I'm going to apologize for what might be perceived as lofty rhetoric, but I'm going to offer that the typical focus on the more easily measured outcomes, like the mere reduction of problem behavior, is probably, among other things, holding back helping professionals from helping families achieve meaningful outcomes. And these are not pie-in-the-sky outcomes. They are achievable, they are measurable, and behavioral scientists are learning to do both. For many families of children with autism, these balanced outcomes are not realized. Now, it's fairly well documented that with autism, there's a higher likelihood of problem behavior like meltdowns, aggression, self-injury. And it's these behaviors, not autism, but these behaviors that are responsible for some of the highly restricted lifestyles characterized by lack of community access, lack of integration, lack of joy. I want you to take a moment to consider why this happens. In other words, why do lifestyles dictated by problem behavior persist for families of children with autism, at least some of them? Why does the 5-year-old child with autism, who cannot handle any disappointment no matter how slight, and who shows his displeasure with extended episodes of crying and screaming, develop into the 10-year-old child with autism, who now communicates less, who now responds to inevitable disappointments with outbursts and includes self-injurious behavior in the form of face slapping and head banging and aggression towards others? And despite pockets of heightened awareness and hard-earned insurance regulation and the involvement of multiple credentialed professionals, why does this boy mature into the 15-year-old with autism, who has not come close to realizing his potential, given his cognitive capacity, but who instead communicates even less and engages in the same forms or topographies of problem behavior, add a few more, but he engages them to a lesser extent because of his routine engagement in solitary and usually stigmatizing activities? I'm framing this question in the not so uncommon story of how lifestyles dictated by problem behavior develop for many families with children on the spectrum. Causes of these sort of restrictive lifestyles, of these minimal developmental trajectories, which are not rare for persons with autism, are complex. Please know I get that. There are clearly multiple responsible factors. But I'd like to draw your attention away for a bit from the often repeated responses of not enough resources or insufficient parent or teacher adherence to the behavioral intervention plan. I'd also like to draw your attention away just for a bit from the pervasive stories about the unique neurobiology of persons with autism, which sometimes leads to an acceptance of problem behavior and the resulting restrictive lifestyle as inevitable. I would like instead for you to consider the manner in which these problem behaviors are typically and professionally addressed. And that is, problem behavior of children with autism is merely modified, medicated, mollified, microanalyzed, or remedied apart from the development of critical social skills. All of these approaches here in red, they may reduce problem behavior, at least in the short term, and thereby reinforce their adoption and implementation by well-meaning helping professionals and parents. But because these strategies usually omit any attempt to understand the relevant context and outcomes driving the problem behavior prior to its treatment, the problem behavior usually returns and the lifestyle develops. The lifestyle dictated by problem behavior may also persist because these strategies either slow down learning or they do not leave the challenging, or what I will eventually call the evocative situations, intact. Therefore, children do not learn the necessary social skills to be effective in the same mundane situations that will present themselves time and time again. Let's start a little bit with behavior modification. Please know that BMOD is the foundation from which applied behavior analysis was built, but also please know that despite BMOD and applied behavior analysis retaining some overlap, they are quite different approaches to addressing problem behavior. Behavior modification usually involves providing some reward or privilege or upgrade for not engaging in the problem behavior, while also necessitating some worsening, technically known as punishment following problem behavior. Perhaps this is something like timeout or response cost. Because the reason the child was engaging in problem behavior in the first place is not considered with the traditional BMOD approach, it's not surprising that problem behavior eventually returns, especially as the rewards get old and the program worsenings become tolerable. They become incapable of inspiring further heroic inhibition of responses that satisfy an unmet need for the person with autism. Modification. Fancy word, it just means appeasement, and it may be just as troublesome as behavior modification. Modification may be written in a formal plan or may be applied more informally by caring parents and teachers. For instance, loving parents may continually inventory the things that seem to annoy their child with autism or that routinely occasion severe problem behavior, and then constant efforts to remove or minimize those events and interactions from the person's life are made. Now, the problem with modification is that no one can protect a person from all the annoyances and triggers. They will be experienced at some point in the context when the main modifier takes a break, and their well-meaning efforts to protect the person with autism from the annoyances and triggers has, again, that unfortunate side effect of removing opportunities to teach the person with autism how to handle those mundane events when they are unexpectedly experienced or to be expected with certainty. The solution that goes beyond modification, medication, and modification is to understand why problem behavior is occurring prior to treating it. Now, the overly general why can be translated here too. What are the events and interactions following the problem behavior that serve to reinforce the problem behavior? Now, these particular understandings may be gleaned from a process called functional assessment, and I will get to that in a moment. But before I do, I want to first acknowledge that there are problems with the functional assessment process as it is typically described and implemented, and especially problems with the state-of-the-art approach referred to as the functional analysis. And the main problem with the analysis is that it is overly reductionistic. It takes the naturally occurring reinforcement contingencies that influence problem behavior in homes and schools, and it breaks them apart in unnatural ways. The problem is evident by the fact that socially meaningful outcomes from this overly reductionistic approach have not yet been reported, despite its long history, journal prevalence, and general esteem. Now, this overly reductionistic approach has also migrated or been extended to treatment, in which various problem behaviors exhibited by the same child with autism, let's say, in the same context, are addressed by different behavior programs, and these are written in addition to, and often implemented separately from, programs to address skill deficits. I'm going to show you today that there is a process that avoids these unfortunate 5 M's, that retains both professional and scientific humilities, that's analytic without being unnatural, that yields a single program for addressing problem behaviors, and simultaneously provides a beginning approach and a lasting framework for addressing the core deficits for children and persons with autism. So let's look at it from a bird's eye perspective first. Why does problem behavior occur? Causes are complex. I want you to first consider all of them. And just within seconds of considering all of them, you should already be overwhelmed, as I usually am. I want you next to consider the causes that you as a parent, you as a teacher, you as a professional can do something about. I whittled down that complex list quite quickly. And for me, the thing I land on most often, are the consequences for behavior, because my working assumption is it's the outcomes of the behavior that drive the behavior. When these outcomes are favorable, we call them reinforcers. My job primarily is to look for those reinforcers for the problem behavior. I hope you can share with me this powerful working assumption. It's not a blame game, but it's a powerful assumption. It is this: if problem behavior like meltdowns, aggression, and self-injury are occurring with regularity, that behavior is being reinforced. That's the working assumption, and it's a very powerful working assumption because it takes all the complex causes regarding problem behavior and brings it to something actionable. Let's go through a few examples. Perhaps attention from others is one of the possible reinforcers for problem behavior. This is commonly understood. So attention, please know, is not always important to any child. Something usually happens that establishes its value to a child. In this example, mom directing her attention to the child's sister may make attention more important for the child with autism and may evoke the throwing of toys, for any child that is, and that may result in mom now attending to the child who threw toys. So this is a simple example of reinforcement in action. What I want to add is we always understand these things called establishing operations as well. And these are simply things that happen before the behavior that seem to make that reinforcer valuable and thus evoke behavior that the child has learned in the past yields that reinforcer. Let's look at a different example. Perhaps continued access to an iPad or some other preferred toys is one of the reinforcers of problem behavior. This might present itself this way. A parent cues a child to put away the iPad. That establishes its value, evokes the SIB, and maybe in the past dad has been reluctant to take it away at that point and gives the child a little more time to finish their play. So please understand that these antecedent events, these establishing operations, are sometimes not that simple, but understand that all people want more of the things they're about to lose right before they know they will lose them. And we see this a lot as a precipitating circumstance for problem behavior of kids with autism. And let's go to a third example. Perhaps the problem behavior is happening to both put an end to something we might call aversive or non-preferred, like onerous academics, and perhaps it's also happening to gain a little bit of a control of the situation and some other things that are valuable to the child. Some children, perhaps after they are instructed to leave a preferred activity to then go do some work, may engage in a meltdown. That meltdown might get them some promises of some better reinforcers later, some reminders of all the good things in the world. And by the end of that conversation, often kids have teachers taking a long way back to the academic classroom. They're choosing which work to do, etc. We used to think that the reinforcers like attention and tangibles and escape, the ones I just showed you, that these things worked independently and almost exclusively. And we now know that they do not. That these reinforcers often work in concert and they are more valuable and powerful together. In other words, the question used to be, is problem behavior reinforced, or sometimes framed as maintained by, attention, or is it maintained by tangibles? Or is the child doing this to get escape, or are they doing it for some sort of sensory consequence? But the question now in this new model is problem behavior maintained by, for instance, escape to attention and tangibles, and perhaps to access some sensory reinforcement? In other words, what is the combination, and what are the specific materials and interactions that are to be combined? It's now understood that there are more qualitatively rich reinforcers influencing problem behavior than the usual suspects of attention, tangibles, and escape. Things like accessing the opportunity to engage in some motor or vocal stimulatory, self-stimulatory behavior, perhaps to engage in some preferred conversations, or resume some sort of physical activity like wandering around the room or looking out the window. Perhaps having someone follow their lead, being the boss, having people do what you ask them to do is a powerfully reinforcing event for all people, and certainly for persons with autism. These are the kind of things we're seeing influencing problem behavior these days, and they are not detectable in the historic one thing at a time model that focused on but a few lanes of reinforcement and made sure we looked at them separately. I want you to also understand that the functional triggers, or what we behavior analysts call establishing operations, are also qualitatively rich, and they're combined as well. In other words, certain things happen prior to problem behavior that are important because they turn on or they turn up the value of events that can serve as reinforcers and therefore evoke behavior to access those reinforcers. Let's go through a couple examples. These are examples that may be affecting you right now, so that's why I put them in here. I'm going to talk about it first in the one thing at a time model. Let's look at this. Let's pretend you haven't had a chance to look at your phone since this morning. You haven't looked at it for quite some time, and that might increase the value of you. Hopefully not, but it might increase the likelihood that you're going to fib and ask to use the potty, leave the webinar, and go use the bathroom just so you can check that phone out. So understand, what is the establishing operation here for the little lie to the supervisor to go check out the phone? It's simple. It's simply not having looked at the phone for a while. But let's look at a different example. Same behavior. You might lie to check out, to go take a look at the phone, but perhaps you've been looking at the phone this whole time, all day, including right now. But you get a text from that guy you spoke with a few moments ago, but he's very important to you. And so you might say you have to use the bathroom even though you don't, just to go check out that phone again. So it's a different establishing operation here. Now, let's pretend it's something different. Let's pretend you've already figured out that this is quite the boring webinar. You've looked at your phone, no guy texted you, but you're still going to lie to get out of that space so you can go check your phone. These are very different reasons to engage in the same behavior for presumably the same outcome. Now that's in the one thing at a time model. I want you to understand the power when we combine things. So let's look at it where these things combined. Let's say you have not looked at your phone since this morning, and that the webinar is certainly boring, and the text from that guy finally arrives, and you haven't looked at your phone all morning, so it's terribly important to you. You will most certainly invent some sort of excretion fabrication to get those reinforcers under those conditions when they're combined, okay? Please also know that your lie is inspired by not just one reinforcer, but by multiple and particular reinforcers. We no longer just try to focus on the one. Please know, if you take off from the webinar to take a look at your phone, you're escaping the webinar, getting access to your phone, and probably doing something quite particular to you, again, perhaps texting that guy. So let me summarize. People with problem behavior are just like you and me. Our behavior is affected by outcomes, and the important outcomes have shades of both terminating some things that are boring or worse, and simultaneously accessing other things that are better. And as the value gap widens between the prevailing context and that of the other possible context, the more likely an extraordinary behavior will be observed. So back to it. How do we figure out which reinforcers, which combinations, which establishing operations are relevant for any particular child? We do this through a process called functional assessment. The goal of the assessment is to identify the outcomes that are maintaining the behavior and the situations that seem to make those outcomes important and thus evoke the behavior. Please know that our job as professionals is to do this quickly and safely, and safety is paramount. Please know also that the ultimate goal of this process is to design a treatment. We're doing a functional assessment and trying to figure out why, so we can design a treatment to make sure that person with autism can achieve those same outcomes with more desirable or acceptable behavior. Now, this emphasis I just shared with you on the many varied and qualitatively rich reinforcers that may be involved for any child It's compounded by the fact that there are many varied contexts in which these behaviors occur. It's very overwhelming to figure out which combinations, which particular reinforcers, which particular establishing operations. It may seem even daunting that the functional assessment process is aimed at determining these things. I want you to understand that this process of functional assessment need not be overwhelming, and it need not be daunting by any means. It can be fairly straightforward. We can whittle down all the possibilities because we use two assessment types. We start with that assumption that almost an infinite number of possible reinforcer combinations and EO combinations may influence problem behavior. But we then do interviews. That's the first step of a process. They're called indirect assessments. They're merely interviews. They're open-ended interviews where people talk to us. And that allows us to quickly move from all that is possible to only some things that are probable. And then we do analyses. The analysis allows us to determine whether those things we thought were possibly influencing behavior actually influence behavior. The analysis is the scientific part of the process. We do a particular analysis called an ISCA. It's horribly named, but it does specify the parts of the analysis that make it unique. Rather than talk about the details, I'm going to take you through a case study and then we'll return to the details. I'm going to describe the assessment process for Gail. Gail was a 3-year-old girl. She was a beautiful little girl, and her mother dressed her impeccably, and she was on the autism spectrum. Despite that, she engaged in a fairly interesting dramatic play. The main reason we met the family was because the young lady engaged in meltdowns at about 5 to 10 times a day, and sometimes they lasted upwards of an hour. These meltdowns involved flopping to the floor, aggressing towards her siblings and her mother, scratching others, and carrying on for quite some time. She was also quite non-compliant to any instructions given by her primary caregiver, which was her mother. So understand the first step of the process is simply an interview. And this interview suggested that Gail engaged in meltdowns and aggression simply to obtain toys, her preferred toys, and her mom's undivided attention. The main point of the interview was to simply ask the parent or teacher to recount several episodes of severe problem behavior, and from these stories we extract the likely reinforcers and the situations that seem to make them important. Please know that in this process we always rely on hypothetical questions because they usually yield the best information. So for instance, in this situation, Mom was asked, if your daughter was in the middle of a meltdown and you could earn $1 million to turn that meltdown off within 10 seconds, $1 million if you can turn it off within 10 seconds, what would you do? Could you do it? And if so, what would you do? And the mother very quickly said, oh, I could do it. And she made it very clear, all I need to do was pull out toys. She had a large handbag and she had some toys in there. She said, I just pull out these toys, I put Gail in my lap, and I give her my undivided attention, and I make sure I talk to nobody else. Please know what I don't ask about the reinforcers. I ask about things that stop behavior, because I understand that reinforcement, although it strengthens the future occurrence of behavior, in the moment it stops behavior. So I simply ask questions about what stops behavior, and this is what the mom shared with me. I then ask a stranger question. I say, Mom, let's pretend your daughter's having a beautiful time. There was another $1 million available if you could make her have a meltdown right now. I know it's a terrible question, but could you do that? Could you make a meltdown happen within 10 seconds? And the mother again was quite confident. She said all I would need to do was abruptly take her off my lap, put her toys away, and start talking to somebody else, or perhaps worse, play with her toys with somebody else. Understand what I'm hearing here are the likely establishing operations, the things in the environment that this little girl experiences that makes particular events very important and then evokes behavior to produce those events. Okay. So simply put, it seems like this young girl was trying to engaging in problem behavior to get attention and stuff, and these things were potentiated when she did not have them or when Mom was allocating them elsewhere. So let's now look at the analysis. What I'm going to do is cut up the analysis into bits and then I'll bring it together. This analysis was done in an outpatient clinic, but please understand we do these analyses in homes and in schools, and there are no particular physical needs like session rooms. But nevertheless, we run an outpatient clinic and we have those spaces. So mom is in the room with the young lady. In the test condition, we simply mimic or emulate the conditions mom described as being responsible for problem behavior. So here mom takes Gail off her lap, says, I'm going to talk to Nick, who's the analyst in the room, and tries to put her toys away. As soon as any problem behavior occurs, we don't wait for a big meltdown to happen, but any form of behavior that mom reported to co-occur in that same situation, mom then is going to reinforce the behavior. And in this case, when mom pulled her off her lap, Gail started to whine and attempted to hit her mother. Her mother quickly said, it's okay, calmed her down, put her back in her lap and played with her and gave her undivided attention for about 30 seconds. And this repeated a handful of times in this 5-minute period. We then replicate those 5-minute periods because for us, replication is the key to believing that this story is indeed influencing problem behavior. But for us, that's not completely sufficient. We also run what we call a control condition in the analysis, and that's what makes it an analysis. In the control condition, there is no if-then. If she engages in problem behavior, then these reinforcers are applied. Instead, there's no establishing operation. What I mean is, mother provides her with her attention and the toys continuously the whole time. And as you can see by these white circles down bottom, there is zero problem behavior under these conditions as we would expect. When you put it all together, that's when we have a functional analysis. Again, this functional analysis required 30 minutes of time. The interview required 30 minutes. And so now our functional assessment process is done in 1 hour, which is at the low end of the range of time it usually takes us. It takes us anywhere from 45 minutes for an entire functional assessment process to sometimes upwards of 2.5 hours. But the average time is just over an hour to complete the process. Okay, what do we have with this analysis? I want to make it clear it's not just that we're confirming the hunch from the interview, although that's important. I talked to BCBA's, Board Certified Behavior Analysts, about this as one form of professional humility that we should share. And that is that we do not believe we understand why problem behavior is occurring, at least what the reinforcement contingencies are, until we confirm the hunch in an analysis such as this. So we have that with the analysis. But we also have a baseline from which to evaluate treatment. And that's important to have. And then third, and perhaps this is most important, we have a motivating condition to teach this young lady skills, and she has learned the game. This happens, my mother does this, I engage in a little problem behavior, reinforcement's restored. She understands now, and her behavior makes it clear she understands that contingency. And our treatment essentially involves escalating the requirements for those same outcomes. By the end, this little girl is going to be engaging in a lot of skills to produce those outcomes instead of any problem behavior. For the professionals that may be watching, these are the methodological bits of the ISCA. We call it an ISCA because all our analyses are informed by an interview. We call it an ISCA because we always use synthesized contingencies, meaning we don't ask a question about escape or attention or tangibles separately. We ask them together, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the importance of synthesis. Before we leave this slide, though, I want to point out this part of the slide right here, this commitment in the ISCA. And that is when we enter an analysis, whether the parent is doing the analysis, the teacher, or an analyst, we make it clear to the team that upon the first instance of any problem behavior, no matter how small, no matter how serious, we're going to provide the presumed reinforcers for that behavior. That's important to us because that's where safety in the analysis is. If you only reinforce dangerous behavior in an analysis, you're going to get it, and you might get it in the context of some emotional responding, and then the reinforcement may not turn that behavior off. If we want to transport analyses to all the conditions under which helping professionals are working, we need to make sure we're focused on safety. And safety can be found in number 4, We call it opening the contingency class. What we've learned through several studies, ours and others, is that if people report problem behavior to co-occur, and you know why one is occurring, it's obvious that that is the same reason the others are occurring. And so please be mindful, if you're going to be analytic, that you take number 4 fairly seriously. Okay, let's talk about another application. I'm going to show you the analysis for Zeke. Zeke was a 14-year-old boy diagnosed with autism. He was served in a specialized school with very good resources. He was one-on-one in that school, although he sometimes had additional staff hovering around because he was a big boy. He engaged in very severe self-injury and severe aggression, sometimes necessitating a team of people to implement safety procedures. The interview, again, we asked very similar hypothetical questions. First mission is, what are the problems? SIB and aggression. We always ask, what else is occurring with those? Because I want to reinforce other members. We heard that there was some foot stomping, there was biting of the finger, and there was slamming elbows or fists on table. We also asked the question, there's $1 million questions. And the story went something like this. $1 million, what could you do to turn off a meltdown, including self-injury and aggression? And the story went like this. We'd make sure there was no signals that teaching would happen. We'd make sure there was no other learner available, so we knew he wasn't going to be grouped. We'd make sure he had a bin of STEMI toys that he liked to engage in, and they had the teacher's undivided attention, and that the teacher followed Zeke's lead. So even though he did not speak, he could communicate that he wanted tickles or to go for a walk or whatnot. Okay, very good. I think I understand some of the reinforcers. $1 million to see if you can make the behavior happen. That question was easily answered as well. She says, well, all we need to do is put the STEMI toys away, bring out the big book of IEP goals and the data sheets and the academic materials, invite other learners over, do not allow for stereotypic behavior to occur, dissuade vocal stereotypy, and get to teaching. So that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff going on. But what I'm hearing is the reinforcers are probably escaping academics with other learners. I'm hearing attention from the teacher. I'm hearing access to STEMI toys and objects to produce some sensory product. And I'm also hearing what we've come to call compliance with MANS, and that is the child being reinforced by the opportunity to make requests upon the adult and have those reinforced. So this analysis, we emulated those stories. In the control condition, the teacher provided her undivided attention. There was no work. She provided access to the STEMI toys, and she did what was reasonably asked from Zeke. By contrast, in the test, those things were removed. When he engaged in any problem behavior, which morphed down to a gentle elbow touch to the table, she would then restore the reinforcers. What we've learned from this is the story the teacher told us was accurate, that Zeke's behavior is indeed sensitive to a combination of these reinforcers. We have a baseline from which to treat, and we think Zeke is now prepared for that treatment game, where we're going to slowly escalate the requirements to produce those same outcomes. Okay, safety. I've mentioned it once, let me mention it one more time. It is terribly important when doing an analysis to be mindful of these 3 things for safety. Many people think safety and analysis can be found by having nurses watch, and that may be helpful, by using perhaps protective equipment, by having termination criteria. Those things are all good. But to me, they're too late. Safety can be found in how you design the analysis. These are the features that we think are most important for designing safe analyses. Number 1, to deliver all reinforcers immediately following all forms of problem behavior reported to co-occur. So that's all 3. Those are the most important things for us to maintain safe analyses. I've only given you 2 examples, so some may be wondering, is this only for children? Is this only good for even children with autism? Does this apply to adults? And I want to tell you that this process of interviewing and doing these short analyses does indeed have generality. This is a study that was published last year in Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. This is 30 cases. These involve children and adults. This is in homes, group homes, vocational centers, specialized schools, and public schools. implemented sometimes by behavior analysts and sometimes by parents or teachers. These involve multiple topographies of problem behavior as well as different functions of problem behavior. My current student and colleague, Adityan Rajaraman, is also preparing a follow-up where we have 50 examples where the analysis that is informed by the interview yielded usable information upon which we treated. Before we get to treatment, I'm just going to take a quick walk down, and by quick, I'm lying because it won't be terribly quick, but I want to walk down this notion of synthesis because for me, it is the reason why we are effective when we are effective. So, if you look at this slide, historically, for many years, like most behavior analysts, I was looking for the influence of single contingencies on the problem behavior of the people I was trying to help. I would ask questions in an OR model. Is behavior maintained by attention, or tangibles, or escape, or some sensory product? Essentially, we've moved the OR and replaced it with an AND. And we ask questions like this: is it maintained by attention and tangibles, or escape from academics to tangibles? And what else? What else is happening when a child escapes? Are they getting attention from others, or are they simply wandering off and engaging in stereotypic behavior? Is it important, does it seem, for the child to make a lot of requests? Is that a reinforcer, having folks comply with their demands? Or is it even more interesting? Are there rituals the child's engaging in, or preferred conversations? And when those aren't had, it evokes problem behavior, and the only way to turn it off is to talk about that unique thing that is important to that child. So again, we've taken the OR, we try to replace it with an AND, said in a different way. Instead of searching for generic contingencies and controlled by the generic contingencies, we're asking questions about combinations. We're really asking questions about interactions, because we think that the natural conditions under which problem behavior is learned and maintained is composed of interacting contingencies. And maybe what we've been doing historically is breaking up those natural contingencies into their little bits. And by so doing, we sometimes render them less powerful than the contingency that's actually influencing behavior in the natural environment. And so we're trying to get back to those interactions. Because of the power, we're seeing that we get quicker analytic outcomes, and as I'll show you, better treatment effects. Let me tell you another reason why we have moved from this one-at-a-time model to this synthesis model. That Gale analysis I showed you earlier was actually extracted from this more complete analysis. What I want to point out first is failure. So when we ran the analysis with the analyst, there was no effect. But when we put the mother in the room, we saw an effect. No effect with the analyst, effect with the mother. This is not really why I'm showing you this, but sometimes we don't get it right the first time, and it's usually because we have an ecologically irrelevant person running the analysis like myself or one of my colleagues, and sometimes it's because we're in an ecologically irrelevant space like a session room as opposed to the home or classroom. But the real thing I want to point out here is we see control when Gale is getting access to tangibles and attention, okay? Now we assess these things separately. So here, for instance, she has mom's attention, but problem behavior would have yielded the toys. Here she has the toys, but problem behavior would have yielded mom's attention. You see here that her problem behavior is not influenced by tangible reinforcement, nor is it influenced by attention, but it is influenced by both. This was our first demonstrations, at least outside of practice context, where we see an interaction where there are no main effects. And this was a very important moment for us because we learned that sometimes whole contingencies have powers that cannot be found in their parts, and we can't evaluate whether this or this is important by evaluating their parts, because sometimes the parts are not relevant and they're only relevant when combined. We thought maybe this was a fleeting phenomenon, but apparently it is not. Now let me make it clear. Sometimes both synthesized and isolated reinforcers influence problem behavior. What I have here is some data from a study published by Dr. Slayton this year in JABA. These are two analyses done with the same child, Dylan, and we have another child, a third child, and a fourth child. Here, the contingencies are synthesized, and you can see we get fast and strong influence on the behavior. Here we've isolated those same exact contingencies, we isolated them. And sometimes we do indeed see that the isolated contingencies influence behavior to some extent as well. We often don't see agreement here, we'll talk about that in a minute, but sometimes we see influence in both conditions. But my emphasis is that we usually do not. We usually do not see isolated reinforcers influencing behavior when we bother to compare them. So here are three examples. We see control by the combined or synthesized contingency here for three folks. We do not see any influence on problem behavior when these same events are assessed separately. And for this child, we see control by the synthesized contingency as replicated. This is not a fleeting phenomenon. We see this here as well with two other participants. We have influence by the synthesized contingency and no clear influence by the isolated contingencies. What's interesting is we have yet to see influence by an isolated reinforcer and no influence when that reinforcer is synthesized with other reinforcers. But we most often see influence by synthesis and no influence by the isolated contingencies. These are unpublished data, part of a different study. It's the same thing. When combined, we see influence. When separate, we don't. 2 out of 3 times. When combined, we do. Again, I'm going to emphasize one last time. This is control by a whole contingency when we do not have control by its constituent parts. As a field, we've been looking at these constituent parts for more than 3 decades. It's not surprising that most analyses that look at the component parts fail more than half the time, even at our best places that do these sort of analyses. It is not surprising any longer to me that we get differentiated or useful outcomes from synthesized analyses very quickly. And we think it's because the contingency is informed by the interview, so it's qualitatively matched or rich for the child. And second, things work better together. In that same spirit, we look back at the literature to see if this phenomenon was there. I always tell my students we've never discovered anything. If you look hard enough, it's sitting somewhere in the literature because we are part of a good science. And indeed it is. When we look back at the literature, there are all these studies that have very nice examples where when they tried to isolate the contingencies, there was no influence. When they synthesized, they saw influence. If you now look here, we also saw the same phenomenon playing out in treatment. In other words, in these studies, when they isolated reinforcers in treatment, they saw no positive treatment effects. By contrast, when they combined reinforcers in treatment, they saw powerful treatment outcomes. This is not new. This is not fleeting. This isn't something only 1 or 2 groups can achieve. This is something that has been sitting in the literature, but we haven't had great language to describe it. One last bit of data here. Sometimes we do see effects of standard analyses where we isolate contingencies, like for these participants, Emily and Jeff. I showed you their data earlier. But when we do a simple treatment, when there's only one reinforcer, we sometimes do not see acquisition of a very simple communication response, and we do not see reduction in problem behavior. And by contrast, we see very fast acquisition of communication responses and fast reduction of problem behavior when these reinforcers are combined. This is not just an assessment, this is in treatment too. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that some of the kids we serve are not motivated to learn a new mand or request to escape to nothing, to get attention with nothing to do, Perhaps it's not a surprise that that same learner will very quickly, within 10 minutes, learn a man to escape to access tangibles and attention, or escape to access tangibles. But the main reason we synthesize, the main reason we do it is because it leads to effective treatment. It also leads to treatment with effect sizes that are socially meaningful. In other words, when the treatment is done, parents usually say, "Thank you. That is a sufficient amount of behavior change. I understand how to manage the behavior. I am not afraid to say no. I'm not afraid to wash the dishes," things of that sort. I want you to take a look at these articles. They're available on the website so you can see the kind of outcomes I'm referring to. I also want you to keep a lookout for this study. This will appear next year in JABA. This is a study that I was not affiliated with, but it's from one of my close colleagues, Dr. Joshua Jessel. What you're seeing here are data points representing the baseline behavior for 25 children with autism that went to a 2-week outpatient clinic where they received experience in our assessment and treatment procedures for 2 weeks, 5 hours a day, I believe it was. Nevertheless, this is the base rate, and this is the rate following the skill-based treatment off of the synthesized analyses. What Joshua also did was he conducted social validity measures with the parents. And what he found was that most parents were highly satisfied with the outcome in treatment or very satisfied with the outcome in treatment. What I'm trying to get at here is, although there may seem to be a loss of precision when you quickly analyze the combinations, what you gain are treatment outcomes that have not been realized until we started combining contingencies in our analyses. If you want to learn more about the assessment process, you can learn more by going to this website. There's also people on that website that are willing to support you if you choose to do that. Okay, let's get to some treatment now. Let's start with Zeke. So you met Zeke earlier. Zeke's problem behavior was indeed to escape academics and maybe group activity, to get access to self-stimulatory behavior and undivided attention of his teacher. So let's go through his treatment process. What we have here is problem behavior. Understand that these data points are taken from his analysis, so we usually don't reconstruct baselines, but we videotape them and measure the skills we're about to teach. The first thing we taught Zeke was a simple communication response. For Zeke, he did not have any vocal behavior of words yet, and so he used a voice output device, Proloquo to Go. We cleared the Proloquo to Go program, so there was just one button at the top layer. When he pressed it, it emitted "My way, please." When he pressed the button, we then provided all those reinforcers I had mentioned. If he would engage in problem behavior, we continued our attempts to teach without access to stimmy toys and whatnot. He learned quite quickly. In fact, in 5-minute sessions, he started to be independent by pressing the button. First take-home point, the first step in treatment is to always find a very simple, new response for the child to emit instead of problem behavior. If you don't see a dramatic reduction, you must not have all the reinforcers, or at least that's our assumption when we do this. We usually see very fast acquisition of the communication and fast reduction in problem behavior because we're using all the suspected reinforcers and we're providing them immediately following a very developmentally easy response for the child. We then move to the next part, and the next part we call complex functional communication training. All this means is we're going to make the response a little bit more ready for prime time, ready for outside of practice sessions, a response that will be a little more appreciable by members of the classroom and perhaps his family. What it looks like is he would engage in an interactional response, perhaps a shoulder tap. Sometimes he simply waved his hand towards the teacher. He was then taught to not use the device until he was acknowledged. He knew he had a listener, and then he had a 2-button press. The buttons were put in layers in the Proloquo to Go, so we would press one button that said, "May I have?" Swipe the device, press the second button that said, "My way, please." When he did that, he was given access to the same reinforcers that were influencing problem behavior. You can see here, he learned this response quite quickly. There was a little bit of variability in problem behavior, and we normally don't proceed until problem behavior is 0 and the response is independent. We have that high criteria because we know if problem behavior persists when we leave the situation, it will get picked up again by reinforcers, especially for a developing young guy like Zeke. So now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce denial. What we're going to do is say no following half of his communication responses. And we're not going to be mild about it. We are going to be fairly assertive with our denials, and we're simply going to prompt Zeke a simple means to communicate that he's okay with that. And so we taught him, and we usually don't teach this anymore, to simply take a breath and nod yes when we said no. And when he did that, we reinforced with the same reinforcers that we discovered in the analysis. So this is what it looks like on a graph. He's still communicating because we're rewarding that immediately half of the time. The other half of the trials, by contrast, we say no. He then engages in a tolerance response, and we say, you're so good at handling disappointment, let's do it your way. And he gets time with reinforcement. What we're trying to do is take the emotional side out of the delay and disappointment cues, teach the child an explicit replacement behavior, and once that's happening to the exclusion of problem behavior, still communicating, tolerating, no problem behavior, then we move on. At this point, what we're going to do is start to chain. We're going to start to put things in place that the teacher has wanted to do, but has been found difficult to do because of the probability of problem behavior. From Zeke's perspective, we're going to teach him that your communication response is going to pay off some of the time, but most of the time it won't. So just handle it. And when he handles it, that will pay off part of the time. But sometimes that won't work. And then the next thing that'll work was doing what you were instructed to do. We asked the teacher to start those instructions very easy. For Zeke, it was some gross motor imitations and things like high five and whatnot. But by the very end of the chaining process, Zeke is engaging in academic materials while his teacher is teaching other children in the small group the exact condition they said would precipitate severe problem behavior. At the end of the analysis, it looks something like this. He is complying to the academic requests, but the teacher is still reinforcing communication and tolerance a bit of the time. Other teachers are then taught on the same procedure that is done here. In these session lengths, although they start out very short, by the end of the process, they're about an hour long, and we're watching the teachers implement the process without problem behavior, but the maintenance of communication, toleration, and compliance. Okay, what's the treatment? What's the name of it? It might be best described as intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement of life skills. We call them life skills because we've done different studies where we've taught these same exact skills, communication, toleration, and compliance, to other learners, and we show that they prevent the development of problem behavior. So these are the kind of skills we focus on with all learners who are at any risk for problem behavior. The shaping up of these skills does indeed take a little bit of expertise. It needs some support by someone that's pretty effective in teaching. The treatment does indeed have these characteristics. The treatment is function-based. The reinforcer is synthesized. It's provided differentially. In other words, we don't reward problem behavior. It has a particular schedule. The response requirement for the child is variable and unpredictable. There's a lot of moving parts. This is complicated at first blush. However, I want to make it very clear, it is not complicated to implement. So this was our first low-tech means by which teachers would implement this. We would write down the behaviors that the teachers would want to see in the classroom that we had worked for a while shaping up. We have some communication responses, we have some toleration responses, and we have some compliance, or what we now call contextually appropriate behavior. 2 trials of work, or 2 minutes of play. 36 trials of work. This probably says 16 trials or 18 trials of work. The teacher simply puts these in her pocket. When Zeke's on reinforcement, she sneaks a peek She now knows that's her next behavioral expectation. And this goes on throughout the day, and that's how we maintain a treatment of such complexity, merely giving teachers a set of expectations that vary. We ask them not to alert the child of what those are going to be, simply to put them in play and to hold them to those high expectations. By having the reinforcement be intermittent and unpredictable, what we're doing is strengthening the chains of communication, toleration, and contextually appropriate behavior. And when one of them doesn't work, what gets induced is another appropriate behavior. And so we're maintaining this repertoire of behavior with the intermittent unpredictable reinforcement, and the engineering of it all is quite simple. Please note all the things we don't need with this sort of function-based treatment. Please understand that the controlling variables for the problem behavior are in the environment we're walking into. We don't need anything extra. All the reinforcers are there. We simply ask people to teach us what they are, and then we use them to shape up these repertoires of life skills. Some people are fairly unimpressed with our low-tech strategies, so we have apps called like this. They're randomizer apps, names in a hat. Another one's called Round'em. It takes a minute or two to program, and the teacher just shakes a smartphone, and it teaches them what the expectation is for that child at that particular moment. This is an example of that Round'em program. Links to these programs are available on that website I had mentioned. Let's talk about Gail. Gail was a 3-year-old child with autism. These are her treatment data. Please understand, by the end of the treatment, this young lady would go into the kitchen in our generality sessions. She would say, "Excuse me, Mom." Mom would say, "Yes, baby, what's up?" "Will you play with me?" Mom would sometimes say, "Yes, of course, stop what you're doing and play with the daughter." But most of the time she said no, and she had to say no because she was the main caregiver. She had other children and elders living in the house. The child was taught, and she would easily say, "Okay, Mommy, no problem," and begin to walk away. And Mom was taught you have to reinforce that sometimes, so that beautiful handling of disappointment happens for a long time. But most of the time Mom did not do that and just expected her little daughter to go and play by herself with maybe some okay toys that didn't require Mom's help. And then Mom was taught, again, you have to pay that off sometimes too. By the end of the treatment with Gail, Mom was able to cook meals and whatnot and eat dinner without Gail in her lap because her daughter had learned to tolerate those periods of time without her mother. Okay. I'm going to go fast through this nitty-gritty. This is just a cost analysis and time analysis. We have more of these data in other articles, but in general, these data are at the high end of the numbers. In other words, it usually takes us about 27 one-hour meetings in a clinic or in a school to achieve these outcomes. As far as cost goes, the families in the clinic receive the services for free. It's part of the university research mission, but in general, the cost averages out to about $6,500. It gets down to, in the low end, $3,000 to $4,000, and at the high end, about $9,000 for this process when a professional such as a BCBA is involved. These numbers are not, this is not cheap, but I just want you to contextualize these numbers. Some of the kids in these studies had been in mental health overnight facilities because their parents could not handle the problem behavior. Those cost upwards of a few thousand a night, and there's no therapy associated with those stays. Many of the kids we serve are on waiting lists for residential treatment. My understanding in Massachusetts, about $300,000 for residential care for a person with severe problem behavior and autism. These kids are still at home. Saving that sort of money. So it's not cheap, but nevertheless, it's a lot less expensive than the alternatives of continuance of severe problem behavior as children age. We also do social validity measures. In other words, we ask parents what they thought about the process, and especially, are they satisfied with the improvement in problem behavior? This is critical. I understand these are subjective measures, but without them, only seeing the direct measures, we're left with, are parents okay with the process? Did we do enough? And until we learn to measure behavior over longer periods of time and in multiple contexts, these do for us. And we usually don't discharge families until we get these sorts of results. We also ask specific questions and make sure parents are more comfortable in the specific challenging situations they reported to us in the initial interview. And finally, we ask open-ended data. We ask open-ended questions about what they thought about the process and the treatment effects. We don't do this for research because these never get published for a variety of reasons. I do this mainly because I want the people working directly with the families to find it reinforcing, to help. And they get very good feedback from families. I also do this because our outcome, as I mentioned, is to restore balance and/or make sure people are leading more of a free lifestyle, and we hear things like that in these open-ended analyses. For instance, for this family, they went to science museums and a beach that is quite chaotic, Hampton Beach, following this process. And this was a family who had never left the house other than to take their child with autism to the doctor or to the school prior to experiencing this process. Okay, I hope you're still with me. What I'm going to do now is go through some of the details of the treatment very quickly, and then we're going to get to the Q&A. And I want you to take a minute. I'll stop talking. Take a minute and look at the words on this slide. This is the treatment, and I hope that these words make sense at this point, and if they don't, they should after the next slide set. Okay, here we go. I want to make it clear that this is not a role play sort of treatment. The treatment is implemented in the most challenging context we can design from the interview that is sufficiently convenient to arrange. I call it the 2 C's of context. So when people do an interview, they might identify a whole bunch of contexts that are associated with problem behavior. What I make clear is we filter this information through the 2 C's. So for instance, let's start with convenient. I do not do functional analyses in the shower or at Denny's restaurant, in church, or in vans, or in public places, because it's not convenient, because I know my analysis is the condition I'm going to use as a practice session until all the skills are built, and so it has to have some convenience to it. However, I also want it to be challenging. The reason why I want it to be challenging is I want the child to be properly motivated to learn the skills. And if it's a very evocative context and the distance between the situation that evokes the behavior and the reinforcement, if that metaphorical distance is wide, I'm going to have a highly motivated child. I'm also going to have a context that if the child can tolerate not having those reinforcers, I know, or not know, but I'm fairly certain that I'm more likely to have generality of that treatment effect than were I to teach these skills in kind of milder conditions, okay? That's like generality going uphill. So if I teach under mild conditions and the child's in a serious condition that I've never taught them the skills in, I think we're going to see recovery of problem behavior. By contrast, if I teach routinely in very evocative situations, there's going to be a therapeutic process where those situations are going to be somewhat revalued. Secondarily, the situations that are milder in which I'm not training in, we should see performance generalized to those. We have a beginning study, it seems to suggest such a thing. Second thing I want to point out, the very beginning of the process, we ask very little of the behavior. I like to say we build trust with the people we serve, and we build trust even in the analysis by teaching them that any little problem behavior will yield a very important outcome. The first step of treatment is very little communication behavior yields that same outcome. It's not variable, it's not unpredictable. It's similar and predictable, and we do that to build trust. We build trust before we start to erode the trust by introducing the ambiguities of life we're trying to prepare the child for. Let's talk about some bits of the communication response that are important. I mentioned simple. I also want to talk about novel. I'm not going to get into the data, but the data are fairly good on don't use an existing mand, use a new mand. Dr. Zarcone from Kennedy Krieger just put out an article showing that kids prefer novel mands in these sort of processes rather than existing mands, which is important as well. Omnibus. That means a command or request that yields all the reinforcers at the same time. Now, I don't want kids going around saying my way for the rest of their careers, but I want to use a response that yields everything at first, because my main mission is to reduce problem behavior, not to teach some sort of language system. That can happen later. So we prefer omnibus commands to start, and finally something that can be effectively prompted. If you can't prompt the response, choose a different modality that can be prompted so you can have that behavior contact reinforcement, and then you're off to the races. Please shape the communication response before you go into tolerance training, or we think that's the proper order. When I mean shape it into something better, I mean these things. Make sure the learner knows how to get someone's attention before they ask them for things. Consider using what people call autoclitic frames. May I have my way, please? May I have blank, please? Because kids tend to put different things in those frames, and it seems to yield new commands that have not been taught, which is a nice effect. We add social niceties, and we work on what speech language pathologists call social pragmatics: proper tone, pace, volume, articulation. We try to make sure that command is the best it can be before we move on. We call it then a complex communication response. A classic example is we teach a child, say, excuse me, wait to be acknowledged from the adult, and then say, may I have my way, please? But I want you to know that we don't end on the omnibus command all the time. There'll be a study coming out by Shannon Ward describing how we differentiate the command. What I mean by that is we always retain the obtaining a listener response, but sometimes we get rid of the omnibus command. We break it apart into its component parts, but we only do that once problem behavior has been effectively eliminated. So this child started out doing some sort of physical command for my way, which is thumbs to the chest. By the end, however, he was using some manual signs to separately get someone's attention, request a break, he had a flourishing, dramatic hand movement to get his stuff back, and then he used the J hand symbol to get people to come over and play with him. So please understand that you may start with the omnibus command, but that does not preclude or prevent you from teaching specific commands. When we get to tolerance response training, I'm showing it to you here in terms of trials. I want you to understand here that we are not doing anything fancy when we introduce denial at first. We're not expecting a lot of behavior. We're simply asking them to handle it by saying things like, okay, I'm good, no problem, or nodding, or giving us a thumbs up. And we do this with intermittent reinforcement, and you can see here I laid out the trials. On one trial, we're reinforcing communication. On another trial, we'll say no and just expect a little bit more behavior, and we just alternate there. Because this is the first time we're introducing disappointment, it's the first time we're introducing ambiguity, we make sure we stay in this phase a little bit longer to make sure there's no emotional responses and the child has mastered the game of disappointment. Once they have done that, we start to chain in those contextually appropriate behaviors, as I had mentioned. And I'm going to show you in some kind of detail how that progression works, because I know it wasn't apparent on any of those graphs. So this might be an early example of the chaining phase. The first trial, we might reinforce communication. In the second trial, we might ask the child to engage in one behavior. And it's a hard behavior, it's a complex behavior. Perhaps it's something in an acquisition program. Once they emit one of those behaviors accurately, then they earn the reinforcers. Now, after the reinforcement is ended, the next requirement is 2 easy things to be done. Then it's a tolerance response, then in the final trial it's 3. Please know we don't foreshadow how much work needs to be done. We just give the instruction, do this work. And when they emit the amount that is on that slip of paper or located on that smartphone, then the teacher reinforces. This process continues. It continues with some sort of prompt like this. This might be a data sheet. What I want you to notice is as you look down the columns, you'll see the numbers grow ever so slightly. They start out, we're asking that they do very little. By the end, they're still doing a little sometimes, but also sometimes they're doing a lot. You'll notice that the average number of reinforcers, average number of responses that produce the reinforcer grows, you'll notice that the range grows as well. We ask for a little bit of behavior in the beginning, a fair amount towards the end. Please note these little guys, the range always stays low. In other words, we always surprise the child that just a little bit of behavior, just a little bit of communication, or a little bit of toleration pays off. We say that keeps hope alive. So the child knows that at any point, any of their behavior, communicating, tolerating, doing a little bit of work, doing a little bit more work, at any time, reinforcement may be provided. And by doing that, the schedule in that way, and not making it clear which behavior will be reinforced, we're able to extend those chains out that are appreciated in classrooms and in homes by family. So this is an example 5-trial sequence at the end of our practice process, and it shows you the range. It shows you sometimes we're requesting 20 hard things be done, and sometimes we're requesting but communication. These are some emphases in that, what some people call delay tolerance training. I'm going to go through these now. Number 1, the delays never end based on time. There are no timers. If you use a timer and you provide the reinforcer when the timer goes off, you're going to reinforce whatever happens to be happening at that point in time, and it may not be the best thing. By contrast, if you only end the delay when they've done things you want to see more of, then you're likely to see more of those things. We don't end delays based on time, we end based on performance, or the amount of accurate behavior. We also end it based on various amounts of behavior. You got to avoid strain. If it's always communication, toleration, or 20 trials, as soon as toleration isn't rewarded, you're going to see problem behavior resurgence. So you got to make it fairly unclear. And we also learned that signaling how much work needs to be done is in no one's interest, meaning it doesn't work better. And we have some interesting studies where we give kids the opportunity to go into spaces where it's highly predictable how much work they need to do, and we tell them exactly how much, or they go into a room where it's fairly ambiguous. The average amount of work is exactly the same, but when it's ambiguous, sometimes it's a little and sometimes it's a lot, and kids, by and large, choose the unpredictable context. So we need to learn more about that. However, I'm fairly convinced that all these warnings and if-thens and schedules and whatnot may be good in the short term, but in the long term, we might want to reconsider them. Okay. I want you to consider this practice session that I showed you. And I want to make a strange point now. There is actually no reinforcement delay in this system. And I think that's arguable when it's done right. Take a look at this strange little chart I put together here. Sometimes we're going to present the evocative event. So for instance, with one of the learners, we talked about removing his preferred goods. The teacher gets an authoritative stance. She's going to now start teaching. The child engaged in communication. She's going to reward that. That's going to happen sometimes. But the next time he may communicate, that's denied. He tolerates, he handles the disappointment, she still gives instruction, and she requests that he does 3 contextually appropriate things before she provides reinforcement. There's clearly a delay, technically, between communication and reinforcement. But please know that that is filled in with behavior. We call that behavior a chain of behavior. Technically, this behavior is reinforced, and this behavior is reinforced by this reinforcer in the chain. Perhaps another framing of this is that there is no delay because there's behavior chains being reinforced in this system. I want you to think about it this way as well. When some of these behaviors do not earn the reinforcer, they complete 3 things here and it still doesn't earn the reinforcer. 5 things doesn't earn the reinforcer. Please understand that there's a lot of non-reinforcement going on here. But what gets induced is not problem behavior. What gets induced is another appropriate response. And we think that is because we're shaping repertoires. If communication doesn't work, try this. If tolerating doesn't work, try try doing what's being asked. Try doing the expected behavior, because just a little bit of it just might pay off. Okay. I want to also emphasize that the chain length is increased, as I showed you. Sometimes they're doing a heck of a lot of work, but please know that we always retain short ones. We don't like our clients to have data sheets where it's very clear how much work is to be done each and every time they do work. We try to emphasize with teachers, end the work when they're being good early some of the time. Those short, unexpected reinforcers are very powerful. We might call them surprise reinforcers. Again, I mentioned it before, I'll mention it here. We might give a child a worksheet with 20 things to do on the worksheet. But when they do, the expectation is they're going to have to do a heck of a lot of math work that they do not like doing, that they're not terribly good at, but they're going to trudge through it. And when they do just a little bit of that work, we reward that. That keeps hope alive. So when we're requesting more work, they might just persist, and they might just persist on that standardized test and those other onerous tasks that are inevitable things that kids have to experience. Let me put it in a different way. Shorties, they never go away. And we love surprise shorties. We love to tell children, okay, get out your history book. We're going to have to write an essay. I'm going to have to edit it. We're looking for grammatical perfection, and we lay it on thick. And that child sits down, gets out that history book, starts reading with a smile on their face. We say, you are the best little guy at handling disappointment. Let's do this later. Let's do things your way right now. That's what I mean by a surprise shorty. That's how you keep hope alive and get really great behavior from kids who had a history of very severe behavior. I'm going to end on this, 2 points. We use the same exact treatment process right now with chronic and intractable motor and vocal stereotypy, the kind that interferes with learning. There are many kids with autism who engage in self-stimulatory behaviors like hand flapping and body rocking and skin picking and lint flicking and all sorts of noises, and they go by the names of self-stim or vocal or motor stereotypy. They're not a problem until they're a problem. And they're a problem when they interfere with learning, or when your attempt to teach them and minimize those behaviors leads to maybe some severe behavior. Then we want to treat them. How do we treat them? We do the same thing I just described to you, the same process. We teach the child to request access to their own stereotypy. We teach them to handle it when we have to say no. We teach them to do contextually appropriate things when they aren't expected to engage in stereotypy, and they learn to do all these things merely to access their stereotypy. And what's really interesting about this phenomenon is that when kids are given a choice after going through these sorts of procedures, do you want to go to the table with your preferred toys and engage in as much stereotypy as you want? Or do you want to go to the table and we're going to block and inhibit your stereotypy? Or do you want to go to a third table? Well, we're going to inhibit your stereotypy. We're going to ask you not to do it. We might block the stereotypy. But if you engage in some contextually appropriate behavior, if you communicate to us, then you can access your own stereotypy. It's not surprising kids don't choose the second option where we're just going to block and restrict. It is surprising they don't choose the first option, which they generally do not, to engage in as much stereotypy as they would like. Instead, they choose the condition in which they earn access to their own stereotypy under unpredictable and intermittent conditions. That is really neat to us. And so I want you to understand that these treatments, especially when we're talking about managing someone's own behavior, their own stereotypy, that the kids are teaching us that they prefer these sort of earned relationships where they engage in some sort of appropriate, appreciable behavior for outcomes that matter to them and outcomes that were driving some severe behaviors or some stereotypic behaviors historically. Last point, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Today was fairly technical. Let's make sure you leave with the most important point, because the technical stuff can always be learned. You can learn it yourself, or you can bring in people who know these things. The people that know these things are often have BCBAs, those letters after their name, they're board certified behavior analysts. There's other helping professionals who can do these sort of things as well. But make sure we get this main point communicated, and that is problem behavior, severe problem behavior of kids with autism is a historical accident, is an accident of learning. Not all kids with autism engage in severe problem behavior. It is not moderated strongly by IQ. It can happen to any family of a child with autism. We don't understand the process, but what we understand is it's fairly accidental. They accidentally learn to engage in more severe forms of problem behavior, extraordinary forms of problem behavior for very simple outcomes. Now, understanding those outcomes and the conditions that make those outcomes important and leveraging them to teach a skill-based repertoire can allow families to be free from the trappings of severe problem behavior. The main message then is that freedom from severe problem behavior is indeed attainable for families of kids with autism. There are some things to consider to get us close to freedom. The first, we need to understand why that child is engaging in problem behavior. We do this with a functional assessment process that includes a practical analysis. Please understand that we can know why or enough about why problem behavior is occurring in a practical process that can be done quickly. Safety can be obtained, can be ensured, and we can do this process analytically. We don't have to sit back on our hunches only or our correlational observational data only. We can change things in the environment, see if it turns on and off behavior. We can do it quickly and safely. We can have that confidence, and then we can use that context that the child has learned the game to begin our skill-based treatment. Again, how can families live free of problem behavior? I don't believe it's possible unless kids are taught skills. The kids need to be taught skills of communication, toleration, and what to do when they can't have those reinforcers in those particular contexts. This takes good teaching. This takes practice. Practice. We have to do a lot of practice sessions to get these repertoires built. They can be built in schools, they can be built in homes, they can be built in clinics, but they need to be built. This is not a do a functional assessment, solution is available tomorrow. We manage, we keep a lid on problem behavior probably by giving reinforcers away for free while we're doing these practice sessions. The practice sessions take some time. Once they have that repertoire built, we've shown we can extend it to all the relevant places kids need to be. How do we extend it? This is the third part that to me is almost a non-negotiable. The schedule is terribly important about how those skills are going to be maintained. And at this point, we're fairly committed to unpredictable and intermittent reinforcement schedules. These are the schedules that seem to maintain repertoires to the exclusion of problem behavior. These are the schedules that keep hope alive. These are the schedules that I hope you would consider using with the technology that I talked about today. Again, if you want to learn more, you can go to this website. I have a great research and practice team. When I present, I always thank them because all of the stuff I share with you is done by them, and they do wonderful work. We're going to now take some questions, and so I hope I haven't been talking for 80 minutes to nobody. I hope Eric and you all are still here, and I'm ready to try to answer some of your questions.
All right, nice job, Greg. We have a number of questions here, so I will do my best to get through them. Real quick, too, before we get started with the questions, I just wanted to mention that BCBAs can submit for Type 3 Cs here, so there's ones that aren't pre-approved, so they can submit those to the BACB. All right, let's get to some questions. Here's an easy one. Are you going to post the slides on your website? Will they be up?
That is an easy one. They are not up yet, but I'm happy to do that. There are similar variants on there now, but no worries. I'll have them up before the night is out.
Okay, great. So I will try to get through these in order as best I can here. Here you go. So what do you recommend for clients with a limited repertoire of independent behavior during the tolerance compliance phase of treatment?
Very good. I want you to draw your attention to a study by Mashid Gayamagami. It's available again on this website if you go to publications, and it's the delay tolerance article. In that article, there were a couple learners, one adult with a very limited repertoire of independent behavior, and another one, a very young child. I think the child was aged maybe 19, 20 months. And so there wasn't a heck of a lot of behavior to reinforce during the delay period. So there's two considerations. Number one is that instead of reinforcing a particular behavior with the termination of the delay, that you put it more into a DRO. What I mean by that is you're going to, after a period of time without problem behavior, then the delay ends and you provide the functional reinforcers. So at least you're reinforcing a period of time without problem behavior. Time-based I worry about because sometimes we accidentally reinforce problem behavior in time-based. But that's something we did with those two learners. And then over time, we carefully started shaping up very simple leisure skills, playing with manipulables and moving on from there. So, but sometimes we do start with a simple DRO and we add the DRA, the differential reinforcement alternative behavior, in there after the fact. Please look at the Gayamagami article for a better description.
Great. I have I guess a parent here saying, what do you say to parent caregivers who start to use the functional communication response outside of the treatment sessions? I assume maybe she means while it's being trained.
Yeah. So we don't encourage it necessarily. We don't necessarily dissuade it either. And we simply talk to parents and share our thoughts. And our thoughts are like this. If we're at the very beginning of the communication phase, the process of treatment, and the child is practicing those communication skills at home under more natural conditions, there are going to be conditions under which the parent cannot reinforce. Now, we haven't taught the tolerance response yet, and so what's going to happen when the parent can't reinforce communication is they're going to communicate more, and then when that doesn't work, problem behavior is going to resurge. And what we're worried about is that those communications and problem behavior are going to get kind of sticky. They're going to chain up. And that can kind of mess things up. So we ask parents not to encourage it. We ask parents to provide a lot of the reinforcers we know influencing problem behavior for free during the time outside of the practice sessions to minimize kids' motivation to communicate. If they do communicate, we try to reinforce immediately as best you can. And those are a general set of instructions. And that outside of session behavior, sometimes communication happens, parent can't reinforce, and there's a little bit of a mess there. It doesn't seem to interfere with the practice process. And but that's the general instruction, and I hope this question asker understands that the logic there. Okay,
great. I have a number of questions, and I'm going to try to bulk them a little bit too, that are pointed towards adults, and that basically there's a few that talk about sort of giving an example of a treatment plan or a practical functional assessment for an adult, and then also talking a little bit about unrealistic expectations, or if they want to avoid the aggression because of the size and the intensity, so on and so forth. So maybe you can talk in general just about doing this with adults and some of the limitations.
Sure. There's certainly sensitivities you need to have when applying this process with adults. I want to make it clear that we've applied this with adults. It's in the articles, although it's not as represented as the children, so that much is true. First sensitivity, it depends on where you're working. If you're working in a group home, or you're working in someone's home, or perhaps a vocational site, you have to take the context into account. And the first thing we try to figure out is who is going to do the practice sessions. And sometimes the relationship is such that we're not available to do that work. We come in as consultants, and so we try to find the group home hero or the vocational hero who's going to implement the practice sessions in our absence. When we visit, we ask them to show us the interaction. We don't ask them to take much data. And then we work for an hour, say a week, shaping up the skills. And we ask that hero to practice. And until the whole repertoire is built, we don't extend it out to the group home staff or the day program staff. The other sensitivity is this whole notion of self-determination. So there's certain reinforcers you have to be mindful of whether or not you can control them, or whether or not someone needs to have continued access to them. We're just starting to develop procedures that is helping us be more effective under those conditions. And I'm going to just move into that just for a minute or two. These procedures are also very important for language-able kids. And I think ultimately this is the way we're going to want to do this process with all children and adults. And we call it, for lack of a better term, the 100% assent process. It looks something like this. The child, or in this case the adult, is given a choice whether they want to come to the practice session or not. They're always given a choice. And it may seem very odd, but most people choose to come to practice sessions. And the reason why we think they do that is not only that we have some great reinforcers in there, despite the drudgery we sometimes put them through, but we think they choose the conditions because there's a contingency, because people prefer to work, people prefer to earn, people prefer to engage in some behavior to access reinforcers. So for instance, we're working with one young man now where he can take his iPad and his other reinforcers and he can leave our practice session and go right down the hall and do whatever he wants with his gear, and his father's there and all that sort of stuff. But he chooses to stay in the practice sessions. And again, we think he does that because there's some contingent relations, because unpredictable intermittent reinforcement in the earning is highly rewarding. So back to adults. There's certainly going to be some conditions under which we're not going to be able to do extinction. We're not going to be able to work an adult through the difficult instruction until they engage in the manned or the tolerance response. And in fact, I think those days, years from now, may be numbered under many, many conditions. And so what is the alternative? The alternative is to identify all the important reinforcers, to teach them to trust you that they can earn them from very simple behavior, and then to slowly increase your expectations and the ambiguities and the disappointments to start to emulate real life. That process works with adults too, and it's completely respectful of people's values in the places you're serving with adults. If you're a parent asking this question, a parent of an adult, I strongly recommend you bring on a professional, probably a board-certified behavior analyst, to help you with this process. But I don't have anything else to share other than we sometimes don't use extinction with adults for obvious reasons, and we're a little more sensitive about the reinforcers and their management, but we can still do this process. I'm happy to report.
Great.
Super.
All right. Questions are coming in very fast, so I'll try to get to as many as I can here.
Yeah, you have a tough job.
Yeah, I work with adults with autism and IDD, oftentimes in a new setting like a group home or similar to foster care. Any suggestions for conducting an ISCA when there is little history known?
Yeah, oh, I see. There's a forced care, so it's hard to find someone who you can speak to identify.
I think the interview part of it, yeah, I think she's speaking to that.
I understand completely. To be honest, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do the functional assessment process until someone had eyes on the person engaging in whatever environment they're in for a little bit of time. You need at least one person who knows the child. I have consulted with people who work in foster care, and they can usually find somebody in the know, even if it's the previous family, and even if it's the previous family for whom the relationship did not work out. And so I think you're very astute that this process cannot be done unless there's at least one person in the know. And if one person isn't in the know, then you let that child or young adult exist in that new environment. Sometimes the new environment is enough that there won't be problem behavior. When that's not the case, someone's had eyes on that kid for at least a week, or adult for at least a week or two, and I would say then you would begin the process. I don't think you need a long history. You just need some history. What you essentially need is at least 3 stories of problem behavior by the same person. 3 stories about what was going on, how does staff react, what happened next, and you just might have enough information from those stories to take that hunch into an analysis. Understand, if your analysis doesn't work, you don't just give up, you try again. You redesign the analysis based on another conversation until you get some influence on behavior, and then from there you start teaching.
Great. All right, I have somebody here who's asking about implementing the practical FA and treatment for a child who's more advanced and less impacted by autism, so has a ton of language and advanced social skills.
Sure.
Do you suggest any adjustments be made? And they give an example of explaining some of the contingencies or explaining what they're doing, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for asking that. We don't know the answer to this. I want to make this very clear. But however, we do this process with language people with very good language, IQs that are average or above average. We work with kids with and without autism, and again, generally speaking, we do the same process. Specifically, however, we do speak to kids that have good language and understand can understand the process. We do talk to them, because when we don't talk to them, some kids can be quite reactive. But let me tell you a couple other things we do with kids that are hyper aware of their surrounding and might be somewhat reactive to these practice sessions. The first bit of advice I would say is, after the analysis is done, you tell them exactly what you're doing, why you're doing it, and you give it some kind of language that would resonate with them. For instance, one of our clinicians in the outpatient clinic talks about being this little guy's coach, and that he's kind of training him for a marathon, the marathon of life. And so we kind of use analogies like that. That child then gets to make a choice whether he wants to come practice for the marathon of life. When they're in those sessions, we'd never make it clear exactly, again, what the expectations are. We still hold true to unpredictable reinforcement, but we tell the child what we're doing. We're trying to create some balance. We want you to make sure you get to have some fun. We want to make sure you get some work done and you really develop and grow as a person. And so we're going to try to put some teaching opportunities in play. So we do talk before sessions about what we're going to do, but we never make it clear exactly how much work is required or what response is going to reinforce when. After sessions, we might ask the child, do you have any questions? How do you think that went? How is this process going? So we ask the same questions we'd ask parents that we would call social validity questions. We ask in an ongoing way sometimes with our kids. And then maybe the third part, well, there's 2 more things. This third thing is that we don't use brief reinforcement, fixed reinforcement periods with savvy kids. In other words, sometimes the reinforcement period is 45 seconds, sometimes it's 4 minutes, sometimes it's 5 minutes. Sometimes we give kids little tokens. They get 1 a day, and that allows them to extend the reinforcement period for quite some time so they can finish a game or a really interesting conversation during the reinforcement interval. And then finally, we give those kids control fairly quickly once the skills are built. So even when we're in the delay part, we give kids choices and all that. And we don't introduce that early, but we introduce it later to start to naturalize the situation and to start to make sure those kids have a good sense of control, for lack of a better word, over the situation. I hope that helped. There's a lot more that needs to be articulated there. We're working on it, but we're reluctant to articulate too much until we've figured it out better.
Great. I have a few people with similar questions to this. I'm trying to hopefully I can knock out a few people's questions with this one. So what is the response when a child engages in aggressive behavior during the work task before the determined number of work tasks are completed?
Very good. Very good question. Yeah. Let me take it back a bit, Eric, because the other questions that are similar might have asked it at this part of the process. Let's say you're just in communication training, okay? And in communication training, we're really adamant about we prompt the communication response before we're likely to see problem behavior, and we know when it's likely based on what we saw in the analysis, so it's not that hard. And then we start fading out our prompts, right, based on time or physical, if it's a physical prompt. If, when we're fading out these prompts, we think the child's fairly independent, we put the evocative situation in place, and they admit problem behavior, what do? Historically, I used to say, well, you don't want to prompt because you don't want to create some kind of chain. You prompt, they engage in communication, now you got a whole mess on your hands. However, when we subjected that to analysis, a woman named Robin Lander did this study, and we should be submitting it soon. What we found is that was terrible advice. And what we found that as long as you prompt before problem behavior and you have a history of that, if problem behavior does come back, it's very important to prompt the correct response at that moment and then reinforce it. And although it's a little risky because you're reinforcing following problem behavior and you might strengthen problem behavior, the bigger risk is not doing anything, because then you're going to get escalation of problem behavior, and that's certainly going to be worse. And so let's take it now to, you're at some long chain. They're expected to do 10 accurate things. They're at 9 and they emit a problem behavior. What do? Our typical response is to not, obviously we don't reinforce the problem behavior, and we simply keep the evocative situation in place. We never said do 10. We just have it written down or it's in our hand. And so we wait until those 10 behaviors happen. Sometimes we would add a prompt, do the work like this, a model prompt, something of that nature. But we keep the expectation in place. And that might seem a little harsh, and it is risky, but please understand it's a progressive treatment. We're doing that with 10 accurate things after he or she has proven they can handle 8 accurate things done. And so please know the progressive nature of the treatment is critical. It's also critical that you don't advance while there's problem behavior. When they're perfect at that level, then you advance the expectation. If you hold fast to those rules, you shouldn't have a lot of resurgence of problem behavior and questions about what to do when that happens. If that is happening to you now, if you're doing this process, I would recommend you go back to a point in the process that was wildly successful and rebuild the skills in a more errorless or a way without much problem behavior.
All right. We have a number of questions actually about generalization, so I'm going to just kind of pluck one here. We've tried your process and it worked in the classroom, but we came unstuck because we couldn't control other environments outside of school where he would do the right thing, but adults responded incorrectly. My question is, how much do you have to train for generalization to other settings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have some answers, but not great answers. We try to program for generalization through multiple exemplar training, I guess you might call it, if you're a behavior analyst. We're not really programming for generalization either. That's really a misnomer. We're programming for generality. And what I mean is we start out in 1 or 2 convenient and challenging practice contexts, and then once we have mastery of the skills there, we've pushed it as far as we need to push it, we introduce relevant people, and then we introduce the treatment to all the relevant contexts. The contexts are those that people described in the interview that we never chose, or we never elected to do the practice sessions in. Those are our candidates for our generality tests. And we do indeed go to those spaces with those people and make sure the child practices their repertoire and they receive that history of intermittent unpredictable reinforcement in those conditions. So given that that's how we generally do things, I would say the answer to your question is yes, you need to program it. I don't believe you can just teach this life skill repertoire and it will extend into environments that they have a history of problem behavior and no history engaging in these skills. Now I think what you'll see, and I'm fairly certain of this because we've done a lot of these generality studies, what you'll see is that the skills will be omitted in those contexts in which they were not taught. That will happen. But you are correct that if people do not reinforce them at least some of the time, they will atrophy quite quickly, they will go away, and problem behavior will resurge. And so you could also look at a study by Kevin Lazinski. It's in the vein of preschool life skills, but he looked at exactly at this question. And so these were kids at risk for school failure for other factors, not autism. And he taught them these skills, same skills, communication, toleration, all that stuff. And then he set them off into a new classroom with a new teacher who knew nothing about their history. And these skills were admitted, they did great compared to the kids who didn't get the curriculum. However, over time, if the teacher was not reinforcing these skills, at least intermittently, they did go away. And so it's kind of a sobering wake up that despite these being great skills that we think are going to get picked up by natural communities of reinforcement, we've been told that they're not going to be if there isn't some sort of instruction, coaching, awareness on the adults in those new settings about what to do with these skills. And Kevin Lazinski's study makes that clear. So it wasn't onerous. It was simply sitting down with the teacher for 20 minutes saying, hey, when they do these things, it's important that you let them pay off some of the time. I think that was pretty much it. And then we saw a wonderful extension into those environments. So, you know, if you're working in a school, you're primarily responsible for how the child's doing at the school. So if you've got that figured out, I mean, if you have control of all those school contexts. So step one is making sure you systematically extend the treatment to the school context. If you're talking about conditions under which you have no control, like the babysitter on the weekend at home, I don't know what to tell you other than to have a family meeting and try to make it clear with that family that these procedures need to be upheld there if you're going to see the same beautiful behavior you're seeing at school.
Great. All right. So I have a question here. It says, for very young children with limited attending skills, it's leading to a few seconds, have you applied the FCR tolerance compliance training successfully?
Yeah. Again, if you look at that that study by Mashid Gayamagami, I believe it came out last year in JABA. It's on. I think the title is "Contingencies Promote Delay Tolerance." One of the participants in that study is very, very young, and I don't talk in terms of attention spans necessarily, but I think they're the kind of profile, if you will, that this person might be referring to, and sure. We just haven't met a child or an adult with disabilities, with severe cognitive impairments, that can't respond to this process. And again, I think the main issue we addressed earlier, and that is when you get to the shaping of the contextually appropriate behavior, sometimes there's not a lot there to work with. And so under those conditions, we're merely reinforcing the absence of problem behavior and trying to put simple manipulables in place to try to shape up some simple play behavior so we can start to strengthen that. But again, I think it's challenging with babies, for instance, but you know, I'm married to a behavior analyst that did a whole bunch of sign training with babies when they were 6 months old, and what we're talking about is that's the first step, and then the next step is tolerance training. And I think the discrimination issues might be real, okay? When you teach more than one response to an infant, for instance, that conditional discrimination is sometimes hard to maintain. Not to get too weirdly detailed, but you might prefer topography-based responses as opposed to selection-based responses, meaning signs or vocalizations as opposed to some touching of a communication device with very young children or folks with severe cognitive impairments, because we think the repertoire is built more cleanly with those motor or vocal, or what we call topography-based responses. But I think that's all I have for you on that one.
Okay. I think we're closing in on 4 here.
Okay.
So I'm going to end with maybe just one more broader question. Many of these questions are very specific. Yeah. And I'll just say, too, to any of the listeners, my email address was given at the beginning. If you have any other questions or things, because, like I said, the questions were coming in very quickly. We're close to 100 questions at this point. Obviously, we're not getting through all of them. But anything that you want to follow up with me, I could either attempt to answer or potentially follow up with Greg. But my email address is eberman@autismnewjersey or autismnj.org. So you can email me any of those questions. But there's just kind of a broad question. Do you find barriers to implementation or things that parents or practitioners fall into that decrease success overall?
It's a super question, and I just don't think I can answer it in the time. There are a lot of barriers. My research group right now is mainly focused on treatment transfer how to extend this treatment into homes and schools, how to get it to work 24/7, and doing maintenance data, big follow-up data. And we're discovering some things. I think the most important thing is when we do the interview, we try to understand parents' concerns about behavioral intervention, what their limitations are, what they've tried, and we'd really try to understand the parents' values well before we start asking them to do anything with respect to treatment. And I know that's fuzzy, but that's probably the most important part of the transfer process. The other part is when we work with children and families, we do all sessions in the presence of families, even in the clinic. And so we build relationship with families, and there's a lot of time to communicate to us all the possible challenges. So we try to design treatments to fit into homes before we try to fit them into homes. And again, not a specific answer, I'm sorry, but we're still learning about that stuff. Eric, when you were mentioning the question stuff, you were cutting in and out for me. I'm sorry, so I didn't quite understand. But I just want to make it clear that I have a research and practice group that their names are located on this website. And so if people want support implementing this process, they might consider going to the website and trying to link up with those people. I have to also admit, I apologize, but I get a lot of questions in my email, and I just can't answer all of them, partly because it's inappropriate for me to give too specific advice and consult over email to a client, and partly I just simply don't have time. So I apologize if you have sent me one of those questions and I have not yet responded. The problem is I respond intermittently. Maybe that's the problem. But nevertheless, I hope to see some of these listeners at a workshop or training. Please feel free to contact me directly if your organization wants a training, and if I can't do it, I have a team of about 20 people who are well versed in these procedures, and they do these trainings as well.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate the clarification there. Well, thank you for your time. It was a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure all of our attendees thought so too. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Eric, and thank you to those who listened. Take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.